The alarm screamed through the corridors of the federal building at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the silence like a razor blade through silk. Emergency lights bathed the hallways in pulsing red, casting long shadows that danced across the walls as personnel moved with practiced urgency. The bomb threat had come in 17 minutes ago, and the evacuation was nearly complete. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nearly Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the edge of the cordoned area, her medical kit slung over her shoulder, watching as the explosive ordnance disposal team assembled their equipment. The device sat in conference room 12B, 3 floors up, described by the anonymous caller as something your boys have never seen before. The building's structural engineers had already confirmed the worst-case scenario. If it detonated, the blast would bring down the entire East Wing. Medical support. Maintain your distance. The voice belonged to Commander Jake Harrison, a 20-year veteran of the EOD unit, who wore his authority like a second skin. He didn't look at Sarah as he spoke. His attention focused on the tactical display showing the building's layout. "We'll call if we need you." Sarah adjusted the strap of her kit and stepped back exactly 2 feet. Not because she agreed with the distance, but because she understood the politics of emergency response. She had been the on-call trauma surgeon for federal incidents for 3 years, and she knew her place in the hierarchy. Medical support stayed back, stayed quiet, and stayed ready to patch up the heroes when they made mistakes. The EAD team gathered in a tight circle around Harrison, their voices low and urgent. Sarah could catch fragments of their conversation over the ambient noise of generators and radio chatter. "Complex triggering mechanism," one of them was saying. "Multiple redundancies." Another voice added, "Timers running backwards from 43 minutes." Detective Maria Santos from the Federal Bureau of Investigation approached the group, her tablet displaying satellite images of the building. The caller was specific about the construction. Said it was built to withstand traditional disarmament. "Techniques," she paused, scrolling through her notes. He also mentioned something about surgical precision being required. Harrison's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Surgical precision. That's what we do, detective. We don't need medical terminology to understand our job." Sarah's fingers tightened slightly on her kit's handle. She had heard variations of this conversation before. The assumption that medical knowledge was somehow lesser, more fragile, unsuited for the brutal realities of tactical situations. She had learned to let it pass, to focus on her role as support staff. The building's chief of security, Tom Bradley, jogged up to the group with a blueprint tucked under his arm. "We've got the architectural plans from 1987, but there have been modifications. The room where the device is located used to be a medical facility before the renovation." He unrolled the blueprint on the hood of a patrol car. "See these markings? That's where the old surgical suite was positioned." Dr. Sarah Mitchell stepped forward slightly, her trained eye catching details on the blueprint that others might miss. The room's layout, the positioning of electrical outlets, the way the ventilation system had been rerouted during the renovation. She had worked in dozens of surgical suites, understood how they were designed for precision, for sterile environments, for steady hands working under pressure. "The oxygen lines," she said quietly, more to herself than to the group. Harrison turned toward her, his expression sharp with irritation. "Excuse me, the old medical suite. Those aren't just electrical modifications on the blueprint. There are remnants of the oxygen delivery system. If someone wanted to create a device that required atmospheric control." "Doctor," Harrison's voice cut through her explanation like a blade, "we appreciate your enthusiasm, but explosive devices aren't diagnosed like patients. This is tactical work. Technical work. We have specialists for this." The dismissal was complete and public. Sarah felt the familiar heat of embarrassment climb up her neck, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago that responding to dismissal with anger only reinforced the stereotype that medical personnel were too emotional for crisis situations. Sergeant Mike Davis, Harrison's second-in-command, was already suiting up in the heavy protective gear that would allow him to approach the device. The suit was bulky, designed to protect against shrapnel and explosive force. But Sarah knew it also limited fine motor control. She had seen similar suits in medical training scenarios, understood how they affected precision movements. Device is confirmed to be a Type 7 configuration, Davis reported through his helmet communication system. Multiple wire arrays, what appears to be a pressure-sensitive trigger, and ... His voice paused. There's something else. It looks like it's been integrated with medical equipment. Harrison's radio crackled with static. Medical equipment? What kind? Surgical instruments, sir. Scalpels, forceps, what looks like microsuturing thread. They're not just attached to the device. They're part of the triggering mechanism. Sarah's pulse quickened. Someone had built a bond that required medical knowledge to understand, but the team was already committed to treating it as a purely technical problem. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it. The hierarchy was clear. Medical support observed. EOD acted. The clock on the tactical display now read 38 minutes. FBI Agent Linda Cooper approached the group with a phone pressed to her ear. We've got partial identification on the caller. Background in both military explosives and medical device manufacturing. This isn't random. Whoever built this thing wanted to create something that would challenge conventional bomb disposal techniques. Harrison's jaw tightened. Conventional techniques have kept people alive for 20 years, Agent Cooper. We don't need to reinvent the wheel because someone got creative with their materials. Sarah watched as Davis, encumbered by his protective suit, attempted to approach the device. Through the building's security cameras, she could see him struggling with the fine motor control needed to examine the intricate wiring. The suit's gloves were thick, designed for protection rather than precision. Every movement was deliberate, but clumsy. I can't get close enough to see the connection points, Davis reported. The medical instruments are creating a barrier. It's like whoever built this thing knew we'd be wearing protective gear. Dr. Patricia Wells, the building's chief administrator, had been standing quietly at the edge of the group. Now she stepped forward, her voice carefully measured. Commander Harrison, perhaps we should consider that the bomber chose this location specifically because it used to be a medical facility. The integration of surgical instruments might not be coincidental. Harrison's response was swift and decisive. Ma'am, I understand your concern, but we have protocols for a reason. EOD personnel are trained to handle any device configuration. The materials used don't change the fundamental principles of explosive ordnance disposal. Sarah could see the flaw in his logic, but she also understood the weight of responsibility he carried. Every decision Harrison made could mean the difference between life and death for thousands of people in the surrounding area. Admitting uncertainty, considering alternative approaches, could be seen as weakness in a situation that demanded absolute confidence. The timer continued its relentless countdown. 35 minutes. Detective Santos received another call. Her expression growing more serious as she listened. We've got additional information about the bomber. Former military medic, discharged after questioning standard protocols. History of believing that medical knowledge was undervalued in tactical situations. She looked up from her phone. This might be personal. Harrison's response was immediate and sharp. Personal or not, we handle this by the book. Davis, continue your approach. Focus on the primary triggering mechanism. Ignore the medical components unless they directly interface with the explosive elements. Through the security feed, Sarah. Watch Davis struggle with the device's configuration. The surgical instruments weren't just decorative. They were positioned at key points where precise manipulation would be required. The scalpels were aligned with wire rays that would need to be cut in a specific sequence. The forceps were positioned near pressure-sensitive elements that would require delicate handling. "Sir," Davis's voice came through the radio with increased strain. "The protective gear is limiting my ability to manipulate the smaller components. The medical instruments are positioned in a way that requires more dexterity than these gloves." "Allow." Sarah's hands moved instinctively to her medical kit. Inside were instruments designed for precision work under pressure. Her fingers had spent years developing the steady control needed for microsurgery, for working in confined spaces, for maintaining calm when lives hung in the balance. "Commander," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline building in her system, "I've worked with these types of instruments for 15 years. If the device requires surgical precision..." "Dr. Mitchell," Harrison's voice carried the weight of final authority, "your expertise is valuable, but this is not a medical procedure. It's an explosive device. Different training, different protocols, different risks." The dismissal was complete, but Sarah noticed something in Harrison's tone. Beneath the authority was uncertainty. He was committed to his approach, but the device was challenging his team's capabilities in ways they hadn't anticipated. Agent Cooper approached Sarah while Harrison continued coordinating with his team. "Doctor, off the record, what's your assessment of the device configuration?" Sarah glanced toward Harrison, then back to Cooper. "The integration of medical instruments isn't random. Whoever built this understands that surgical tools require specific handling techniques. The scalpels need to be manipulated with controlled pressure. The forceps are positioned to require precise grip strength. If the triggering mechanism is integrated with these elements..." "You're saying it can't be disarmed using standard bomb disposal techniques?" "I'm saying it was designed to challenge those techniques. The bomber wanted to create a situation where medical knowledge would be necessary, but they also knew that protocol would prevent medical personnel from being involved in the actual disarmament. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Cooper's expression was thoughtful. "A test. They're testing whether the system can adapt." Sarah nodded. "And the clock is running down while we prove that it can't." 32 minutes remained. The EAD team had established a secondary position, closer to the device, with Davis maintaining his careful approach. But Sarah could see through the security feed that he was struggling with the precise manipulations required by the medical instruments. His movements were becoming more frustrated, less controlled. "Commander," Davis reported, "I'm having difficulty accessing the primary circuit panel. The surgical instruments are creating interference, and the protective gear is limiting my fine motor control. I need to remove the gloves to proceed." Harrison's response was immediate. "Negative. You maintain full protective gear. Find another approach." Sarah understood Harrison's decision. Removing protective equipment violated every safety protocol. But she also understood that the device had been designed to create exactly this dilemma. The bomber had created a situation where traditional safety measures would prevent effective disarmament. Dr. Wells approached Harrison again, her voice carrying more urgency. "Commander, we have over 3,000 people in the surrounding buildings. If the device detona to Gs... I'm aware of the stakes, Dr. Wells. We're proceeding according to established protocols." Sarah watched the clock count down. 29 minutes. The device sat in conference room 12B, its medical components creating barriers that the EOD team's protective gear couldn't overcome. The bomber had created a perfect trap, one that exploited the gap between medical knowledge and tactical training. Through the security feed, she could see Davis making another attempt to access the device's primary components. His movements were careful but clumsy, limited by the protective suit's bulk. The surgical instruments required a delicate touch, an understanding of how they were designed to function. Sarah's hands moved to her medical kit, her fingers tracing the familiar shapes of instruments she had used thousands of times. Scalpels, balanced for precision cuts. Forceps designed for delicate manipulation. Suturing materials that required steady hands and controlled movements. The same hands that had performed microsurgery were now relegated to standing in the background, watching as the clock counted down toward catastrophe. 20-7 minutes. And counting. 6 months before the federal building incident, Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been working the night shift at St. Mary's Emergency Trauma Center when the first bomb threat came in. Not to the hospital, but to the police station 3 blocks away. The device had been crude, barely functional, but it had required the evacuation of downtown Chicago for 4 hours while the bomb squad worked. Sarah had watched from the hospital's break room window as the EO team struggled with what turned out to be a hoax device filled with medical supplies. Someone had packed surgical tubing, syringes, and scalpel handles around a fake explosive core. The bomb squad had treated it as a standard device, using their conventional tools and protective gear, taking nearly 3 hours to determine it was harmless. That night, as Sarah reviewed trauma protocols for the 1,000th time, she had found herself thinking about the intersection of medical knowledge and tactical situations. Her residency supervisor, Dr. James Fletcher, had often said that emergency medicine was just controlled chaos, that the best surgeons were the ones who could think clearly under pressure while working with their hands. She had started researching bomb disposal techniques the next week, not out of any grand plan, but from simple curiosity. The library at Northwestern Memorial had extensive technical journals, and Sarah discovered that explosive ordnance disposal was, in many ways, similar to surgery. Both required steady hands, precise movements, and the ability to make life or death decisions under extreme pressure. The more she read, the more she realized that bomb disposal training focused heavily on the mechanical aspects of devices but paid little attention to the psychological elements. Bombers were human beings, and human beings had patterns, preferences, ways of thinking that could be understood and anticipated. Dr. Rachel Kim, a psychiatrist who consulted on federal cases, had been lecturing at the hospital about criminal psychology when Sarah first approached her about the intersection of medical training and tactical applications. Most people think of bombs as purely technical devices, Dr. Kim had explained during their coffee meeting. But they're also expressions of the bomber's mindset. The way someone constructs a device reveals their background, their knowledge, their psychological state. Sarah had begun attending Dr. Kim's lectures regularly, learning about the psychological profiles of bombers, the way they thought about their targets, the symbolic elements they often incorporated into their devices. She discovered that bombers with medical backgrounds often created devices that reflected their professional knowledge, incorporating medical terminology, using medical equipment, or placing their devices in medical settings. The research had led her to volunteer for the Federal Medical Response Team, a role that put her on call for major incidents requiring trauma care. She had completed the required training at the Federal Emergency Management Agency facility in Maryland, where she had met Commander Harrison for the first time. The training had been thorough but traditional. Medical personnel were taught to establish treatment areas, to triage casualties, to work with law enforcement and emergency responders. But Sarah had noticed a gap in the curriculum. There was no cross-training between medical and tactical personnel. The two groups operated in parallel, rarely sharing knowledge or perspectives. During one training exercise, Sarah had been assigned to observe a simulated bomb disposal scenario. The device had been constructed with medical components, and she had watched as the EAD team struggled with elements that would have been familiar to any first-year medical student. The exercise had ended successfully, but Sarah had realized that the solution could have been reached more quickly with basic medical knowledge. She had approached the exercise supervisor, Captain Robert Martinez, with her observations. The medical components aren't just materials, she had explained. They're functional elements. The way they're connected, the way they're positioned, follows medical logic, not just mechanical logic. Captain Martinez had been polite but dismissive. "Doctor, I appreciate your interest, but bomb disposal is a specialized field. We trained for years to understand how these devices work." The dismissal had been familiar, but it had also motivated Sarah to continue her research. She had begun studying the history of explosive devices, focusing on cases where medical knowledge had been relevant to disarmament. The patterns were clear. Bombers with medical backgrounds created devices that challenged traditional disposal techniques, and the success rate for disarming these devices was lower than average. Sarah had started practicing with deactivated medical equipment, learning to manipulate surgical instruments while wearing heavy gloves, understanding how protective gear affected fine motor control. She had set up scenarios in her apartment, using dummy devices to practice the kind of precise movements that might be required in a real situation. The breakthrough had come during a trauma surgery rotation at Cook County Hospital. Sarah had been working on a patient with multiple abdominal wounds when she realized that the approach required the same kind of systematic thinking used in bomb disposal. Identify the problem, isolate the dangerous elements, work systematically to neutralize threats without causing additional damage. Dr. Angela Rodriguez, the chief of surgery, had been impressed with Sarah's performance during the rotation. "You have natural instincts for working under pressure," she had told Sarah during their evaluation meeting. "But more than that, you understand how to think systematically about complex problems. That's a rare skill." The conversation had led to Sarah's assignment to the hospital's disaster response team, where she had gained experience in mass casualty scenarios. The training had included simulations of terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and industrial accidents. Sarah had learned to work in chaotic environments, to maintain focus while surrounded by noise and confusion, to make critical decisions with incomplete information. One simulation had involved a scenario where a bomb had been placed in a hospital operating room. Sarah had been assigned to medical triage, but she had noticed that the device description included surgical instruments as components. She had approached the scenario commander with her observations about the medical elements, but had been told to focus on her assigned role. The simulation had ended with the device exploding because the EOD team had been unable to understand the medical components. Sarah had realized that her insights could have prevented the simulated casualties, but the rigid separation between medical and tactical roles had prevented effective communication. She had begun developing her own training protocols, combining medical knowledge with tactical thinking. In her spare time, she had practiced working with medical instruments under stress, learning to maintain precision while wearing protective gear, understanding how to adapt surgical techniques to unusual situations. The real test had come during a hostage situation at Northwestern Memorial 6 months later. A former patient had barricaded himself in the pharmacy, claiming to have explosives. Sarah had been on duty in the emergency room when the incident began, and she had been assigned to medical support for the tactical response. The suspect had been a former medical technician with knowledge of hospital systems. He had constructed a device using medical supplies and hospital equipment, positioning it in a way that required understanding of medical procedures to approach safely. The bomb squad had been called in, but they had struggled with the medical components of the device. Sarah had watched from the command post as the tactical team attempted to understand the device's construction. The suspect had used 4 tubing, surgical clamps, and monitoring equipment to create a complex triggering mechanism. The EOD team had treated it as a standard device, but the medical components had created unexpected challenges. "The clamps aren't just holding wires," Sarah had told the incident commander. They're positioned to mimic arterial clamps. The person who built this understands surgical procedures. The triggering mechanism follows medical logic. The incident commander, Deputy Chief Frank Sullivan, had been more receptive than others. Sarah had encountered. "What are you suggesting, Doctor?" "The device is designed to be approached like a medical procedure. The bomber is thinking like a surgeon, not like a typical bomber. If we approach it with medical knowledge, we might be able to anticipate the triggering sequence." Sullivan had allowed Sarah to consult with the bomb squad, and her insights had helped them understand the device's construction. The situation had been resolved without casualties, and Sarah had realized that her combined knowledge of medical and tactical procedures could be valuable in crisis situations. She had spent the following months developing her expertise further, studying advanced bomb disposal techniques, practicing with increasingly complex scenarios, learning to think like both a surgeon and a tactical specialist. She had reached out to retired bomb disposal experts, learning from their experiences, understanding how medical knowledge could complement traditional techniques. The preparation had been methodical and thorough. Sarah had studied the psychology of bombers, the mechanics of explosive devices, the history of incidents where medical knowledge had been relevant. She had practiced working under pressure, maintaining precision while wearing protective gear, adapting surgical techniques to tactical situations. She had also developed relationships with key personnel in the federal response community. Agent Cooper had been impressed with Sarah's insights during the Northwestern Memorial incident and had recommended her for the federal medical response team. Dr. Kim had continued to mentor Sarah's understanding of criminal psychology, helping her develop profiles of bombers who incorporated medical elements into their devices. The training had been comprehensive but unofficial. Sarah had never sought recognition for her tactical knowledge, understanding that the medical and tactical communities remained largely separate. Her role was medical support, and she had accepted that limitation while continuing to develop expertise that might someday be needed. The federal building incident had been exactly the scenario Sarah had been preparing for, but she had also understood that her preparation would mean nothing if the tactical commanders weren't willing to consider alternative approaches. The bomb squad had protocols, chains of command, established procedures that didn't include consultation with medical personnel on tactical matters. Sarah had watched from the command post as the situation developed, her training and preparation allowing her to understand the device's construction in ways that the tactical team couldn't. She had seen the patterns, recognized the psychological elements, understood how the bomber was thinking. But she had also understood that her insights would only be valuable if someone in authority was willing to listen. The clock had continued counting down, and Sarah had realized that all her preparation might be meaningless if the rigid separation between medical and tactical roles prevented effective communication. She had been ready for this moment, but the system hadn't been ready for her. 20-4 minutes remained on the countdown when the reinforcements arrived. The FBI's elite bomb disposal unit pulled up in 3 black SUVs, their specialized equipment already prepped for immediate deployment. Agent Timothy Brooks, the unit's commanding officer, stepped out of the lead vehicle with the confidence of someone who had seen every possible configuration of explosive device. "Commander Harrison," Brooks called out as he approached the command post, "we've got intel on the bomber." Former Navy medic, discharged after filing complaints about safety protocols. Real name is Marcus Webb, and he's been planning this for months. Harrison's expression tightened as he reviewed the file Brooks handed him. "Planning what exactly? What's his endgame?" "Near as we can tell, he wants to prove that medical knowledge should be integrated into tactical operations. The device isn't just meant to explode, it's meant to demonstrate a point." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had suspected the psychological element, but hearing it confirmed made the situation more complex. This wasn't just about stopping a bomb. It was about proving or disproving the bomber's thesis that medical expertise was essential for certain tactical situations. Dr. Marcus Webb had been a Navy corpsman for 8 years before his discharge. His military records showed exemplary service in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he had saved dozens of lives under combat conditions. But his efficiency reports also documented increasing frustration with what he saw as the artificial separation between medical and tactical personnel. Webb filed 17 formal complaints about protocol conflicts. Brooks continued, reading from the file. He documented situations where medical knowledge could have prevented casualties, but military hierarchy prevented medics from contributing to tactical planning. The parallel to Sarah's own experiences was unmistakable. Webb had faced the same dismissals, the same institutional barriers, the same frustration at being relegated to support roles while possessing knowledge that could save lives. Agent Cooper approached the group with her laptop open, displaying Webb's psychological profile. Dr. Kim completed her analysis an hour ago. Webb isn't trying to hurt people. He's trying to force a conversation about how we handle crisis situations. The device is designed to be disarmable, but only if we approach it with the right combination of knowledge. Medical knowledge, Sarah said quietly, more to herself than to the group. Brooks turned toward her, his expression sharp with professional interest. You're the trauma surgeon assigned to medical support? Dr. Sarah Mitchell, she replied, extending her hand. I've been studying the intersection of medical and tactical procedures for about 6 months. Studying it how? Sarah felt the familiar weight of skepticism in his question, but Brooks seemed genuinely curious rather than dismissive. I've been researching bombers with medical backgrounds, understanding how they think, how they construct devices. I've also been practicing surgical techniques under tactical conditions. Harrison interrupted before Brooks could respond. Agent Brooks, with respect, we're not here to validate anyone's theories. We have a device to disarm and protocols to follow. Dr. Mitchell's insights might be valuable for the post-incident analysis, but right now we need to focus on the technical aspects. Brooks studied Harrison for a moment, then glanced at Sarah. Commander, I've seen Webb's work before. 3 years ago in Detroit, he built a device that challenged conventional disposal techniques. The team that successfully disarmed it had to think outside standard protocols. And what happened in Detroit? They brought in a medical consultant. The device was disarmed without incident. The tension in the command post shifted perceptibly. Sarah could sense the conflict between Brooks's willingness to consider alternative approaches and Harrison's commitment to established procedures. The clock continued its relentless countdown, 22 minutes. Detective Santos received another call, her expression growing more serious as she listened. We've got movement on Webb's known associates. 3 of them are former medical personnel who were also discharged for protocol violations. This might be bigger than we thought. Bigger how? Harrison asked. The device in the federal building might not be the only one. We're getting reports of suspicious packages at medical facilities across the city. All of them seem to be configured with medical components. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Webb had created multiple devices, all designed to challenge conventional bomb disposal techniques, the implications were staggering. The city's bomb disposal resources would be stretched thin, and each device would require the same kind of specialized knowledge that the current team was reluctant to utilize. Brooks pulled out his secure phone and made a quick call. This is Agent Brooks. I need a full deployment of medical consultants to all active bomb sites. Yes, medical consultants. We're dealing with devices that require specialized knowledge. Harrison's radio crackled with an update from Sergeant Davis. Commander, I'm having increasing difficulty with the device's medical components. The surgical instruments are creating a barrier that I can't navigate with the protective gear. I need either different equipment or a different approach. Maintain your current position, Sergeant. Do not remove any protective equipment. Sarah, Watch the security feed as Davis struggled with the device's intricate construction. The surgical instruments weren't just obstacles. They were integral to the device's function, positioned with the precision of someone who understood medical procedures intimately. "He's thinking like a surgeon," Sarah murmured, studying the device's configuration on the monitor. "What did you say?" Brooks asked. "Webb. He's not just using medical instruments. He's positioned them according to surgical logic. The scalpels are oriented for precision cuts. The forceps are aligned for delicate manipulation. The suturing material is threaded to maintain tension. It's not random placement." Brooks stepped closer to the monitor. "You're saying the device follows medical procedures?" "I'm saying the disarmament sequence probably follows surgical procedures. Webb is challenging us to think like medical professionals, not just like bomb disposal experts." Agent Cooper joined the conversation, her laptop displaying architectural plans of the federal building. "The location supports that theory. Conference Room 12B used to be a surgical suite. Webb specifically chose a room with medical history." Harrison's frustration was becoming more evident. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with an explosive device, not a medical procedure. The approach remains the same regardless of the materials used or the location chosen." "Commander," Brooks said carefully, "I understand your position, but we need to consider that Webb has specifically designed this device to challenge conventional approaches. If we're not willing to adapt our methods, we might be playing into his hands." Sarah could see the internal conflict in Harrison's expression. He was a professional with decades of experience, but he was also facing a situation that challenged everything he had been trained to believe about bomb disposal. The device wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a psychological and philosophical challenge to the entire structure of emergency response. Dr. Wells approached the group with her secure phone in hand. "I've been in contact with the mayor's office. They're asking for regular updates on our progress. The potential casualty count, if this device detonates, is over 8,000 people. The weight of that number settled over the command post like a physical presence. 8,000 lives depending on decisions made in the next 20 minutes. Sarah felt the responsibility, but she also felt the frustration of having knowledge that could help while being prevented from using it. "Agent Brooks," she said, "if I'm right about the surgical logic, then the device requires a specific sequence of actions, not just cutting wires or removing components, but following a procedure that mimics surgical techniques." "What kind of procedure?" Sarah studied the device configuration on the monitor, her medical training allowing her to see patterns that others might miss. The forceps are positioned like arterial clamps. The scalpels are oriented for sequential incisions. The suturing material is maintaining tension across multiple connection points. It's designed like a complex surgical procedure. "You're saying we need to approach it like surgery?" "I'm saying Webb expects us to approach it like surgery. The question is whether we're willing to do that." Harrison's radio crackled again. "Commander, we're getting reports of similar devices at 3 other locations. All of them seem to be configured with medical components. The teams at those sites are requesting guidance." The scope of Webb's plan was becoming clear. He hadn't just created one device. He had created a coordinated challenge to the entire emergency response system, forcing multiple teams to confront the same limitations that Sarah had been observing for months. Brooks made another call, his voice tense with urgency. "I need all available medical consultants deployed to active bomb sites." "Yes," I said, "medical consultants. And I need them there in the next 15 minutes. Sarah felt a surge of mixed emotions. The situation was validating her belief that medical knowledge was essential for certain tactical situations, but the validation was coming at the cost of thousands of lives at risk. Detective Santos approached with updated intelligence. "We've identified Webb's current location. He's holed up in an abandoned medical facility about 20 miles from here. He's been monitoring our response through hacked security feeds. He's watching us fail, Sarah said quietly. What do you mean? Brooks asked. He's not just trying to prove a point about medical knowledge. He's trying to demonstrate that the current system is inadequate. Every minute we spend debating whether to use medical expertise, every protocol we follow that prevents effective response proves his thesis. Harrison's expression hardened. Doctor, this isn't about proving theories. This is about following established procedures that have kept people alive for decades. Commander, Brooks intervened, the procedures that have kept people alive for decades are being challenged by someone who understands their limitations. Maybe we need to consider that adaptation isn't a weakness. The command post fell silent except for the constant chatter of radio communications and the hum of electronic equipment. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the tension between rigid adherence to protocol and the flexibility that might be necessary to save lives. Agent Cooper's laptop chimed with an incoming message. We've got communication from Webb. He's willing to provide guidance for disarming the devices. What kind of guidance? Harrison asked. He wants to speak directly to medical personnel involved in the response. He's refusing to communicate with tactical teams. Sarah's pulse quickened. Webb was forcing the issue, creating a situation where medical expertise wasn't just helpful, but essential for communication with the bomber himself. This is manipulation, Harrison said firmly. We don't negotiate with terrorists, and we don't let them dictate our response procedures. Commander, Brooks replied, if communication with Webb can save 8,000 lives, don't we have an obligation to consider it? The debate was interrupted by another radio transmission from Sergeant Davis. Commander, I've reached the limit of what I can accomplish with standard equipment. The device is specifically designed to challenge conventional approaches. I need either modified equipment or a different strategy. Sarah watched the security feed as Davis stepped back from the device, his frustration evident even through the bulky protective suit. The surgical instruments continued to create barriers that conventional bomb disposal techniques couldn't overcome. 19 minutes, Agent Cooper announced, her voice tight with tension. Dr. Wells approached Harrison with her phone extended. Commander, I have the mayor on the line. He's asking for our assessment of the situation and our confidence level in successful disarmament. Harrison took the phone, his expression grim. Mr. Mayor, we're proceeding according to established protocols. The device is complex, but we have experienced personnel working on it. Sarah couldn't hear the mayor's response, but she could see Harrison's expression change as he listened. The political pressure was mounting, and the clock was running down. Yes, sir. We'll continue to explore all available options. Harrison ended the call and looked around the command post. We have 18 minutes to resolve this situation. Agent Brooks, what's your assessment? My assessment is that we're facing a new type of threat that requires a new type of response. Webb has created devices that challenge our traditional methods, and we need to adapt or risk massive casualties. And you think medical personnel should be involved in tactical operations? I think we need to use every resource available to us. If medical knowledge can help us save lives, then we need to consider it seriously. Sarah felt the moment building toward a decision point. The rigid separation between medical and tactical personnel was being challenged by circumstances that made such separation potentially catastrophic. Dr. Mitchell, Brooks said, turning toward her, if you were given the opportunity to examine the device directly, what would you need? Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. I'd need to understand the specific surgical procedures that Webb has incorporated into the device. I'd need to examine the positioning of the medical instruments and understand how they interface with the explosive components. And I'd need to work with someone who understands the technical aspects of the device. You're talking about direct examination of an active explosive device, Harrison said. That's not within your training or authority. Commander, Sarah replied. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. But I've spent that time preparing for exactly this type of situation. I understand the risks, but I also understand the potential benefits. The command post fell silent again, the weight of the decision settling over everyone present. Sarah could see the conflict in Harrison's eyes, the battle between years of training and the recognition that traditional methods might not be sufficient. 17 minutes, Agent Cooper announced. The clock continued its relentless countdown. And Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of thousands of people, but the future of how emergency response teams approached complex crisis situations. The gathering storm was about to break, and Sarah knew that her months of preparation had led to this moment. The question was whether the system would allow her to use what she had learned, or whether protocol would prevent her from contributing to the solution. Webb's challenge to the emergency response system was forcing a confrontation between rigid adherence to established procedures and the flexibility that might be necessary to save lives. Sarah stood at the center of that confrontation, her medical knowledge and tactical training making her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between two worlds that had never been designed to work together. The next decision would determine whether her preparation had been worthwhile or whether the system's limitations would prove too strong to overcome. 16 minutes remained when the reports began flooding in from the other bomb sites across Chicago. The specialized FBI teams that had been deployed to each location were encountering the same obstacles that Sergeant Davis faced in the federal building. Each device incorporated medical components in ways that challenged conventional bomb disposal techniques. Agent Brooks stood at the communications hub, coordinating with teams across the city. His expression grew increasingly grim as each report confirmed the same pattern. Experienced bomb disposal experts struggling with devices that required medical knowledge to understand, let alone disarm. Site 2 reports that their device is configured with cardiac monitoring equipment, Brooks announced to the command post. The team leader says the triggering mechanism appears to be integrated with an EKG machine. They can't figure out how to approach it without setting off what looks like a heart rate monitor. Sarah recognized the psychological complexity of Webb's plan. Each device wasn't just a technical challenge. It was a statement about the artificial barriers between medical and tactical knowledge. The cardiac monitoring equipment would require understanding of how medical devices functioned, how they were calibrated, how they responded to different inputs. Site 3 is reporting similar issues, Brooks continued, his radio crackling with updates. Their device incorporates surgical suturing equipment. The team can't access the primary components without understanding how the suturing tension affects the triggering mechanism. Commander Harrison's jaw tightened as he listened to the reports. His decades of experience had prepared him for complex devices, but not for devices that required knowledge outside his area of expertise. The situation was forcing him to confront the limitations of traditional bomb disposal training. All teams are requesting guidance, Brooks said, looking directly at Harrison. They're asking if we have medical consultants available to assist with technical assessment. How many civilians are we talking about? Harrison asked. Detective Santos checked her tablet. Site 2 has approximately 3,000 people in the immediate blast radius. Site 3 has around 1,500. Combined with our location, we're looking at potential casualties in the tens of thousands. The weight of those numbers settled over the command post like a physical presence. Sarah could see the calculation in Harrison's eyes, the balance between maintaining protocol and accepting the reality that lives hung in the balance. Agent Cooper's laptop chimed with another message from Webb. He's offering to guide us through the disarmament process, but only if we acknowledge that medical expertise is essential for tactical operations. He's holding hostages to make a point, Harrison said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Commander, Brooks replied, if his point saves lives, does the motivation matter? Sarah watched the security feed as Sergeant Davis made another attempt to approach the device. His movements were becoming more tentative, less confident. The surgical instruments continued to create barriers that his training hadn't prepared him to overcome. The forceps are positioned across the primary circuit board, Davis reported through his radio. I can't access the board without manipulating the forceps, but I don't understand how they're supposed to function. They're not just holding wires, they're part of the circuit itself. Sarah's medical training allowed her to understand what Davis was describing. Surgical forceps were designed for precise manipulation of tissue, requiring specific grip techniques and controlled pressure. Someone without medical training would struggle to use them effectively, especially while wearing protective gear. Can you work around them? Harrison asked. Negative, Commander. The forceps are integral to the device's construction. I'd need to understand how they're supposed to be manipulated to proceed safely. The radio fell silent, and Sarah could feel the tension in the command post reaching a breaking point. The clock continued its countdown. 14 minutes. Dr. Wells approached the group with her phone. I've got the Chief of Emergency Services on the line. He's asking about our evacuation options if we can't disarm the devices. Harrison took the phone, his expression grim. Chief, we're working on disarmament. Evacuation at this point would be ... double quotes. He paused, listening. No, sir, we can't evacuate tens of thousands of people in 14 minutes. The conversation continued, but Sarah could see the reality settling over Harrison's face. There was no backup plan. No evacuation option. No alternative to successful disarmament of all 4 devices. Brooks received another update from Site 2. Their team leader is requesting permission to consult with medical personnel. He says the cardiac monitoring equipment is beyond his expertise. What kind of medical personnel? Harrison asked. Cardiologists specifically. Someone who understands how the monitoring equipment functions, how it responds to different inputs. Sarah felt the moment building toward a decision point. The rigid separation between medical and tactical personnel was becoming impossible to maintain in the face of Webb's challenge. Agent Cooper looked up from her laptop. Webb is monitoring our communications. He's watching us struggle with the very problems he designed the devices to create. He's proving his point, Sarah said. Quietly, what point? Harrison asked, his frustration evident. That medical knowledge is essential for certain tactical situations. That the separation between medical and tactical personnel creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited. Harrison's radio crackled with another update from Davis. Commander, I'm at an impasse. I can't proceed without understanding the medical components. I either need different equipment or different expertise. The command post fell silent except for the constant background chatter of radio communications. Sarah could feel the weight of the moment, the recognition that traditional methods were insufficient for the current crisis. 13 minutes. Agent Cooper announced. Brooks made a decision. I'm authorizing medical consultation at all bomb sites. We need cardiologists at Site 2, surgical specialists at Site 3, and... He looked at Sarah. We need someone with general medical knowledge who understands surgical procedures at our location. Harrison's expression was conflicted. Agent Brooks, with respect, we're talking about putting civilians in direct contact with explosive devices. The liability alone. Commander, Brooks interrupted, the liability of an action is tens of thousands of casualties. I'll take responsibility for the decision. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she had been preparing for, but the reality of it was more intense than any training scenario. The device was real, the stakes were real, and the time was running out. Dr. Mitchell, Brooks said, turning to her, are you willing to consult on the device configuration? Sarah looked at the security monitor showing the device in conference room 12B. The surgical instruments were positioned with precision. The connections were complex, and the entire configuration reflected Webb's medical background. Her months of preparation had led to this moment. "I'm willing to consult," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Harrison stepped forward. "Doctor, I want to be clear about what you're volunteering for. This is an active explosive device. The risk of detonation is real. You would be putting yourself in direct danger. Commander, I understand the risks. But I also understand that my knowledge might be the key to saving thousands of lives." Brooks nodded. "What do you need from us?" Sarah's mind raced through the requirements. "I need to examine the device directly, understand how the medical components interface with the explosive elements. I need to work with someone who understands the technical aspects of bombs, and I need communication with Webb if he's willing to provide guidance." "You're talking about direct examination of the device," Harrison said. "That requires protective equipment, safety protocols, backup procedures. I understand the protocols, Commander. But I also understand that conventional protective equipment might limit my ability to work with the surgical instruments effectively." The tension in the command post was palpable. Sarah could see the conflict in Harrison's eyes, the struggle between his training and the recognition that desperate situations might require desperate measures. Agent Cooper's laptop chimed with another message. "Webb is willing to provide guidance, but only if medical personnel are directly involved in the disarmament process. He's refusing to communicate with tactical teams alone." "He's forcing the issue," Harrison said. "Yes, he is," Brooks replied. "But he's also providing a path to resolution. The question is whether we're willing to take it." Sarah watched the security feed as Davis stepped back from the device, his frustration evident even through the protective suit. The surgical instruments continued to create barriers that conventional training couldn't overcome. 12 minutes. Agent Cooper announced. The clock was running down, and Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of the crisis, but the future of how emergency response teams approached complex situations. Webb's challenge was forcing the confrontation between rigid protocol and practical necessity. "Dr. Mitchell," Brooks said, "if we proceed with your consultation, what's your assessment of the likelihood of successful disarmament?" Sarah studied the device configuration on the monitor, her medical training allowing her to see patterns that others might miss. "The device is complex, but it follows logical medical procedures. If I'm right about the surgical logic, then it can be disarmed safely. But it requires understanding of medical techniques, not just bomb disposal techniques. And if you're wrong?" "If I'm wrong, then we're no worse off than we are now. But if I'm right, we might be able to save thousands of lives." Harrison's radio crackled with updates from the other sites. Site 2 is reporting that their cardiologist consultant has identified the trigger mechanism. They're proceeding with disarmament under medical guidance. Sarah felt a surge of hope. If medical consultation was working at other sites, then her approach might be successful as well. Site 3 reports similar progress, Brooks added. Their surgical specialist has identified the suturing pattern that controls the device's stability. The pattern was clear. Medical knowledge was proving essential for understanding Webb's devices. The question was whether the system would adapt quickly enough to prevent catastrophe. "Commander," Sarah said, looking directly at Harrison, "I know. This challenges everything you've been trained to believe about bomb disposal. But sometimes the situation requires us to adapt beyond our training." Harrison studied her for a long moment, then looked at the security monitor showing the device. "Doctor, if we proceed with your consultation, you'll be working directly with an explosive device. Are you prepared for that reality?" Sarah felt the weight of the moment, the responsibility of thousands of lives, the culmination of months of preparation. "Commander, I've been preparing for this moment for 6 months. I understand the risks, but I also understand the potential to save lives." The command post fell silent as Harrison considered the decision. The clock continued its relentless countdown, And Sarah realized that the next few minutes would determine whether her preparation had been worthwhile or whether protocol would prevent her from contributing to the solution. 11 minutes. Agent Cooper announced that the competition between rigid protocol and practical necessity was reaching its climax, and Sarah stood at the center of that conflict, her medical knowledge and tactical training making her uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between two worlds that had never been designed to work together. 10 minutes. 37 seconds remained when Commander Harrison finally made the decision that would change everything. His voice carried the weight of 20 years of experience and the recognition that sometimes survival required abandoning everything you thought you knew about how things should work. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, his tone formal but resigned, "you're authorized to consult on the device configuration. But you work with Sergeant Davis as your technical support. You maintain radio contact at all times, and you follow my orders without question." Sarah felt her heart rate spike, but her voice remained steady. "Understood, Commander. I'll need to examine the device directly to understand how the medical components interface with the explosive elements." Agent Brooks was already coordinating with the other sites. Site 2 reports successful disarmament using medical consultation. The cardiologist identified that the EKG machine was monitoring the bomb squad's heart rates through proximity sensors. Once they understood the medical logic, disarmament took 3 minutes. The success at Site 2 provided crucial validation, but Sarah knew that each device would present unique challenges. Webb wasn't just testing the system's ability to adapt. He was testing whether medical and tactical personnel could work together effectively under extreme pressure. Site 3 is proceeding with surgical guidance, Brooks continued. Their specialist identified that the suturing pattern was designed to mimic a complex medical procedure. They're following surgical protocols to disarm the device. Sarah gathered her medical kit, her hands moving with practiced efficiency through instruments she had used thousands of times. But now those same instruments would be used in a context she had only imagined during her months of preparation. "Dr. Mitchell," Detective Santos said, approaching with her tablet, "we've established communication with Webb. He's willing to provide guidance, but he wants to speak with you directly." Sarah looked at Commander Harrison, who nodded grimly. "Put him through." The voice that came through the speaker was calm, professional, tinged with the authority of someone who had spent years saving lives under combat conditions. "Dr. Mitchell, I've been monitoring your situation. You understand what I'm trying to prove. I understand that you believe medical knowledge should be integrated into tactical operations," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline. "But I also understand that you're putting thousands of lives at risk to make your point." Webb's response was immediate. "Those lives are already at risk because of the system's refusal to adapt. How many casualties could have been prevented if medical personnel were included in tactical planning from the beginning?" Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice, the same frustration she had felt during months of being dismissed by tactical teams. But she also heard something else, the desperation of someone who had chosen extreme measures because he believed conventional approaches had failed. "Dr. Mitchell," Webb continued, "the device you're facing follows the logic of a complex surgical procedure. The forceps aren't just components. They're positioned to mimic arterial clamps during cardiac surgery. The scalpels are oriented for sequential incisions. The suturing material maintains tension across multiple connection points." Sarah studied the security monitor as Webb spoke, her medical training allowing her to see the patterns he was describing. The device wasn't just incorporating medical components. It was designed to function like a surgical procedure, requiring the same kind of systematic approach she would use in an operating room. "What's the disarmament sequence?" she asked. "That's something you'll need to determine based on your medical knowledge. I can provide guidance, but the solution requires understanding of surgical procedures that tactical training doesn't cover." Commander Harrison's expression was tense. "Doctor, we're not negotiating with a terrorist about how to disarm his device. We're gathering information to support our tactical response." "Commander," Sarah replied, "with respect, this isn't a negotiation. It's a consultation. Webb is providing medical guidance for a device that requires medical expertise to understand." The distinction was crucial. Sarah wasn't just communicating with a bomber. She was consulting with a medical professional who had created a device that challenged conventional approaches. The dynamic was complex, ethically ambiguous, but potentially life-saving. 9 minutes, Agent Cooper announced. Sarah began moving toward the building entrance, her medical kit secured across her shoulder. Sergeant Davis joined her, his protective gear modified to allow for the fine motor control that the medical components would require. "Doctor," Davis said through his helmet communication system, "I want you to know that I've never worked with medical personnel on a tactical operation. I'm not sure how to coordinate our approaches." "Sergeant," Sarah replied, "think of this as a surgical procedure where you're providing technical support. I'll handle the medical components, you monitor the explosive elements, and we communicate constantly about what we're seeing." The approach was unprecedented, but Sarah's months of preparation had included scenarios where medical and tactical personnel would need to work together. She had practiced communication techniques, coordination protocols, ways to bridge the gap between two different types of expertise. They entered the federal building through the main entrance, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The evacuation had been complete, leaving behind only the essential personnel needed for the disarmament operation. The building felt hollow, charged with the tension of impending crisis. "Dr. Mitchell," Webb's voice came through the communication system, "you're approaching the device now. Remember that the medical components aren't just materials. They're functional elements that require understanding of how they're supposed to work in a medical context." Sarah and Davis reached the 3rd floor, the red emergency lighting casting long shadows across the hallway. Conference room 12B was 50 feet ahead, its door standing open like a mouth waiting to swallow them. "Radio check," Commander Harrison's voice crackled through their communication system. "Dr. Mitchell, clear," Sarah responded. "Sergeant Davis, clear," Davis confirmed. They approached the doorway slowly, methodically, following protocols that had been adapted for this unique situation. Sarah could see the device through the doorway, its complex configuration of medical and explosive components, exactly as Webb had described. "Visual contact with the device," Davis reported. "Medical components are integrated throughout the explosive elements. I can't distinguish between decorative and functional elements." Sarah stepped into the room, her medical training allowing her to see patterns that Davis couldn't recognize. The surgical instruments were positioned with precision, their orientation following the logic of medical procedures rather than random placement. "The forceps are positioned like arterial clamps," she reported. "They're not just holding wires. They're maintaining pressure across multiple connection points, the same way they would control bleeding during surgery." "Dr. Mitchell," Webb's voice came through the communication system, "you're beginning to understand the device's construction. The disarmament sequence requires following surgical protocols, not bomb disposal protocols." Sarah approached the device slowly, her hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The months of preparation had led to this moment, but the reality was more intense than any training scenario. "The scalpels are positioned for sequential incisions," she continued her assessment. "They're oriented to follow the pattern of a complex surgical procedure. The suturing material is maintaining tension across the entire configuration." Sergeant Davis monitored the explosive elements while Sarah examined the medical components. Their coordination was tentative at first, but gradually became more natural as they learned to communicate across their different areas of expertise. 8 minutes. Agent Cooper's voice came through the radio. Sarah's hands moved to her medical kit, extracting instruments that she had used thousands of times in surgical procedures. But now those same instruments would be used to disarm a device that could kill thousands of people. Dr. Mitchell, Webb said, the device is designed to be disarmed by someone who understands surgical procedures. The sequence begins with releasing the arterial clamps in the correct order, followed by precise incisions that will isolate the explosive elements. Sarah studied the forceps positioning, her medical training allowing her to understand the logic of their placement. In cardiac surgery, arterial clamps were released in a specific sequence to prevent bleeding and maintain circulation. The same logic applied to the device's construction. "Sergeant Davis," she said, "I'm going to begin releasing the arterial clamps. Monitor the explosive elements for any changes in configuration." "Understood, Doctor. I'm ready to respond if there are any signs of instability." Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, her fingers manipulating the forceps with the same controlled pressure she would use in surgery. The first clamp released smoothly, its tension transferring to the remaining clamps without affecting the device's stability. "First clamp released," she reported. "No change in device configuration." "Dr. Mitchell," Webb's voice carried a note of approval, "you're following the correct sequence. The second clamp requires more delicate handling. It's positioned across a pressure-sensitive element." Sarah examined the second forceps, understanding its position relative to the device's other components. The clamp was maintaining pressure across a connection point that would require careful manipulation to avoid triggering the explosive elements. "Sergeant Davis, the second clamp is positioned across what appears to be a pressure-sensitive trigger. I need you to monitor for any changes as I release it." "Roger, Doctor. I'm watching for any signs of instability." Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision, her fingers applying the controlled pressure needed to release the clamp without triggering the pressure-sensitive element. The months of practice with modified equipment had prepared her for this moment. "Second clamp released," she reported. "Device remains stable." 7 minutes, Agent Cooper announced. The countdown continued, but Sarah felt her confidence building. The device was responding to surgical techniques, validating her understanding of Webb's construction logic. The integration of medical and tactical expertise was working. "Dr. Mitchell," Webb said, "you're approaching the critical phase. The remaining clamps are positioned to maintain tension across the primary explosive elements. The release sequence must follow the logic of cardiac surgery." Sarah studied the remaining forceps, understanding their position relative to the device's explosive core. The clamps were maintaining pressure across connection points that would require sequential release to prevent catastrophic failure. "Sergeant Davis, the remaining clamps are positioned across the primary explosive elements. I need you to be ready to respond immediately if there are any signs of instability." "Understood, Doctor. I'm monitoring all explosive elements." Sarah's hands moved with practiced precision, her surgical training allowing her to understand the complex interplay between pressure, tension, and timing that the device required. The third clamp released smoothly, its tension transferring to the remaining clamps without affecting the device's stability. "Third clamp released," she reported. "Device remains stable." "Dr. Mitchell," Webb's voice carried increasing urgency. "The final clamp is the most critical. It's positioned across the device's primary trigger mechanism. The release requires perfect timing and pressure control." Sarah examined the final forceps, understanding its crucial position in the device's construction. The clamp was maintaining pressure across the connection point that controlled the device's explosive elements. Its release would either complete the disarmament sequence or trigger the device's detonation. "Sergeant Davis, this is the critical moment. The final clamp controls the device's primary trigger mechanism. I need you to be ready for an immediate response." "Roger, Doctor. I'm ready." Sarah's hands moved with surgical precision, her fingers applying the controlled pressure needed to release the final clamp. The months of preparation, the hours of practice, the understanding of surgical procedures under pressure, all converged in this single moment. "Final clamp released," she reported. The device's explosive elements powered down, their connection points isolated by the sequential release of the arterial clamps. The medical components had been neutralized by following surgical logic rather than bomb disposal protocols. "Device disarmed," Sergeant Davis confirmed. "All explosive elements are stable." 6 minutes and 12 seconds remaining, Agent Cooper announced, her voice carrying relief and disbelief. Sarah stepped back from the device, her hands steady despite the adrenaline that had carried her through the disarmament sequence. The months of preparation had led to this moment, and the integration of medical and tactical expertise had saved thousands of lives. "Dr. Mitchell," Webb's voice came through the communication system. "You've proven the point I was trying to make. Medical knowledge is essential for certain tactical situations. The separation between medical and tactical personnel creates vulnerabilities that can be exploited." Sarah looked at the disarmed device, understanding the complexity of what had just occurred. She had successfully disarmed a device that conventional bomb disposal techniques couldn't handle, but she had also validated a terrorist's thesis about the inadequacy of current emergency response protocols. "All sites report successful." "Disarmament," Agent Brooks announced over the radio. Medical consultation was essential at every location. The moment of truth had passed, but Sarah realized that the implications would continue long after the immediate crisis was resolved. The rigid separation between medical and tactical personnel had been challenged and found wanting. The system had been forced to adapt, and the adaptation had saved lives, but the cost of that adaptation had been accepting guidance from someone who had put thousands of lives at risk to prove his point. The ethical implications were complex, the precedent was troubling, and the questions about emergency response protocols would continue long after the devices were disarmed. Sarah had proven that medical knowledge was essential for certain tactical situations, but she had also proven that the current system was inadequate for addressing complex threats that cross traditional boundaries between different types of expertise. The moment of truth had revealed both the potential and the limitations of the current approach to emergency response, leaving questions that would need to be answered in the aftermath of the crisis. The silence in the command post was deafening. For 17 seconds, nobody moved. The digital countdown had stopped at 6:12, frozen in place like a held breath. Agent Brooks stared at his radio, waiting for confirmation that seemed too good to be true. "All sites confirm successful disarmament." The voice finally crackled through the speakers. Medical consultation was essential at every location. "Repeat, all devices have been neutralized." Commander Harrison stood motionless, his 20-year career in explosive ordnance disposal suddenly feeling inadequate. Everything he had believed about proper protocols, about the clear separation between medical and tactical personnel, had been challenged and proven insufficient in the span of one morning. How is that possible? He muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Agent Cooper pulled up the tactical reports on her laptop, her fingers moving quickly across the keys. Site 2, EKG device disarmed by cardiologist in 4 minutes. Site 3, surgical suturing mechanism neutralized by trauma surgeon in 6 minutes. Site 4, respiratory equipment configuration solved by a pulmonologist in 3 minutes. Detective Santos shook her head slowly. Every conventional bomb disposal team failed. Every medical consultant succeeded. Dr. Wells approached the group, her expression a mixture of relief and bewilderment. The casualty estimates were over. 30,000 people across all sites. Dr. Mitchell and her colleagues just prevented the worst terrorist attack in Chicago's history. Through the building's security system, they watched Sarah emerge from conference room 12B alongside Sergeant Davis, Her medical kit was still slung across her shoulder, but her posture had changed. The dismissed support staff member who had entered the building was gone, replaced by someone who had proven her expertise under the most extreme circumstances possible. "Dr. Mitchell," Harrison's voice came through the radio. "Return to the command post for debriefing." Sarah's response was measured, professional. "Copy that, Commander. Sergeant Davis and I are en route." Agent Brooks began coordinating with federal agencies, his tone carrying new authority. "I need immediate psychological evaluation for Webb and his associates. I also need a full review of our emergency response protocols. This incident has exposed significant gaps in our preparedness. The implications were staggering." Webb had demonstrated that a determined adversary with medical knowledge could create devices that traditional bomb disposal training couldn't handle. The rigid separation between medical and tactical personnel had created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone who understood the system's limitations. "We're going to have to completely restructure our approach," Brooks continued. "Medical personnel need to be integrated into tactical planning from the beginning, not brought in as an afterthought." Harrison's radio crackled with reports from the other sites. Team leaders who had spent decades in bomb disposal were acknowledging that medical consultants had accomplished what their specialized training couldn't. The professional pride that had driven their resistance to outside expertise was crumbling in the face of undeniable results. "Commander Harrison," the voice from Site 2 reported, "the cardiologist identified trigger mechanisms that we never would have recognized. The device was designed to exploit our lack of medical knowledge." Site 3 confirmed similar findings, another voice added. "The surgical specialist understood the device's construction logic immediately. We were approaching it from the wrong direction entirely." Sarah and Davis entered the command post, their faces showing the strain of the morning's events, but also the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The room fell silent as they approached, dozens of tactical specialists and federal agents recognizing that their fundamental assumptions about emergency response had been proven wrong. "Dr. Mitchell," Harrison said, his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been there hours earlier, "your assessment of the situation was correct. Medical knowledge was essential for disarming these devices." Sarah nodded, her response careful and measured. "The devices were designed to challenge conventional approaches, Commander. They required understanding of medical procedures, not just bomb disposal techniques." "How did you know?" Detective Santos asked. "How did you understand what Webb was trying to do?" "I've been studying the intersection of medical and tactical knowledge for months," Sarah replied. "I recognize the psychological patterns, the way someone with medical training would think about creating devices that challenge the system." Agent Cooper looked up from her laptop. "Webb has been taken into custody. He's requesting to speak with you, Dr. Mitchell. He wants to discuss the implications of what happened here today." Sarah considered the request, understanding the complexity of the situation. Webb had put thousands of lives at risk, but he had also exposed critical vulnerabilities in the emergency response system. The conversation would be ethically complicated, but potentially valuable for preventing future incidents. "I'll speak with him," she said, "but I want to understand his motivations, not validate his methods." Dr. Wells approached Sarah with her secure phone. "Dr. Mitchell, I have the mayor's office on the line. They want to personally thank you for preventing a catastrophic loss of life." Sarah accepted the phone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Mr. Mayor, I was just doing my job. The system worked because people were willing to adapt when circumstances required it." The mayor's response was brief but heartfelt. The city had been saved by someone who had been dismissed as mere support staff hours earlier. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the command post. Agent Brooks ended his call and turned to address the group. "Federal headquarters wants a complete review of this incident. They're particularly interested in Dr. Mitchell's methodology and how we can integrate medical expertise into our standard protocols. Harrison stepped forward, his expression serious. Dr. Mitchell, I owe you an apology. I let protocol override judgment, and that could have cost thousands of lives. Your expertise was essential, and I should have recognized that sooner. Sarah's response was gracious but firm. Commander, the protocols exist for good reasons. But situations like this demonstrate that we need flexibility to adapt when circumstances require it. The room buzzed with activity as federal agents began documenting the incident, interviewing personnel, and analyzing the devices that had been disarmed. Sarah found herself at the center of attention, her insights suddenly valued by the same people who had dismissed her hours earlier. Dr. Mitchell, Agent Brooks said, we're going to need your help developing new protocols. This incident has shown us that our approach needs to evolve. Sarah nodded, understanding that the morning's events had changed more than just emergency response procedures. The rigid boundaries between different types of expertise had been challenged and found wanting. The system had been forced to adapt, and the adaptation had saved lives. But she also understood that the real work was just beginning. Integrating medical and tactical expertise would require institutional changes, new training programs, and a fundamental shift in how emergency response teams approached complex situations. Women who had been dismissed as support staff had proven that knowledge transcends traditional boundaries. That expertise can come from unexpected sources, and that the willingness to adapt can mean the difference between catastrophe and salvation. The stunned recognition in the command post wasn't just about Sarah's success. It was about the realization that the system itself needed to change, and that the person who had been overlooked and underestimated had shown them the way forward. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.